Why do people join cults? What makes them disappear from the face of society to live with a bizarre gang of deranged, violent religious fanatics? We don't like to think about them, but every society has its misfits. People who can't quite march to the same beat as others. They seem to go against modern conventions by having a deep-seated desire not for freedom but for servitude. They live desperate lives because the freedoms around them make them listless and impotent to make choices. The frequent emphasis our culture has on personal choice and sating physical needs and desires is repugnant to them. The physical world in general and their own body in particular are a source of shame and disgust. They've never accustomed themselves to having a fleshy shell that they must respond to. They become withdrawn, sullen, and extremely impressionable. They secretly desire a leader, someone to order them and make them feel worthwhile by being used as a slave, perhaps consciously reliving or reinforcing mental abuse or isolation. The characters live in their own heads, a misty world of emotions separating them from reality and preventing them from seeing the truth. They're isolated, and the only people they can relate to and speak with are other broken people who are in no position to help them. It could be said that Silent Hill 2 broke away from the cult storyline and lived in its own space, but I don't think that's exactly true. The main characters of the second game are mysteriously drawn to the town. They feel a strange lure pulling them to the abandoned ruins of Silent Hill. The men and women were broken inside and suffering tremendous mental torment. They were also easy to control because of their poor willpower. Eddie is a weak fool who runs away from his problems even though he doesn't know if anyone suspects him of anything. He also loathes and is disgusted by his own body, which he thinks is grotesque, fat, and ugly. He assumes people hate him without really knowing if they do. He also feels like an aggrieved victim who has to lash out brutally to avoid the abuse he feels he suffered. Angela was brutally abused by her father and slips into meekness and terror like a small child. Both come to very dark conclusions about how to fight back against those that have wounded their psyche. They, along with the game's protagonist, James Sunderland, have come to the town to die by their own hand. Inner-directed hatred and neurosis have destroyed any sense of individual identity. In our freedom-loving age, it's easy to forget how much of human history was spent in abject control and domination by a tiny few. There may be something deep within all humans that compels us to obey and serve if our will, happiness, and confidence break down. Silent Hill 2 asks an interesting question. What if people drawn to the town found no cult to worship? Weak-willed, sullen, easily manipulated, and self-loathing. These are the perfect qualities for recruitment into a cult. Even after the annihilation of the town and most of the cult's leaders in Silent Hill 1, the strange presence still lingers. The spiritual energy in the woods continues to magnetically pull perfect candidates for new cult members toward the town. The psychic wreckage left over after the town's private apocalypse still feeds and taunts the mentally wounded. The spiritual force in the town is said in Silent Hill 2 and 4 to have been rather different in the past. It was not an evil force, and the ugly cruelty and violence of prison camps, plagues, cults, and war in the 19th century caused a vicious psychic change. Perhaps in a way, the spiritual energy of the town is itself a victim, a good, or at least not evil force that was corrupted, broken, and twisted into ugliness and pain through the grim interactions with heartless people. The cult in Silent Hill is mysterious, and we're never fully introduced to a detailed look at their beliefs. But from the scraps of information about the cult's adherents, it seems to fall into a familiar pattern. A massive emotional underpinning is the notion that the real, everyday world is evil or corrupt. The world is tainted or morally impure, so to stay spiritually clean you must hide in an ethereal realm dedicated to higher matters outside the purely physical. But in the rush to become a renunciate, a seeker may not see that the cult of Silent Hill seems to be dedicated to, shall we say, lower matters. Unlike reality, where we can get only glimpses of this inner realm, we get to see hell incarnate in Silent Hill. The hell they live in every day. The hell they imagine the world to be. And a very real hell conjured by a demon. For the wretches drawn to the town, the cult may be the only link they have to avoid total self-immolation. It is there for them when the potential cultist is weak and desperate for help. The victim, dominated by a charismatic prophet, is then sent to commit evil acts. Unwittingly, they taint themselves with real evil and fulfill their own prophecy of self-loathing. If they already feel horrible about themselves, why not do something horrible to justify that pre-existing feeling? Their abuse as children, a common trait in followers of cults, has instilled a sense that they must be punished. Others are socially isolated and left in the bizarre, unmanageable predicament of judging, loving, and conversing with themselves rather than letting others fill that role. The lonely and wounded would cry out and seek anything to relieve their emptiness. The games ask another fascinating question. What if something actually answered the prayers of the religious? The cultist Walter Sullivan is a perfect example of the circle of sin and punishment. Walter began his life in dire straits. Just after his birth, the tiny infant Walter was abandoned by his parents and left to die. He was rescued and eventually adopted by the cult. With no ties to anyone and a profound sense of confusion and abandonment, Walter became contemptuous and hostile towards almost everyone else. Desperately yearning for a family, Walter became obsessed with the cult and its teachings. In order to fulfill the cult's prophecies, Walter continued dark rituals of violence and evil and eventually took his own life. The worlds Walter creates from his subconscious are violent, dark, and cruel. The creatures populating them are disgusting monsters that writhe, make unbearable noises, and try to harm you everywhere. The 21 sacraments he performs mention being freed from the bonds of flesh, as if having a physical form is a shackle or chain holding you back. Though a serial killer, Walter exhibited both inner and outer-directed loathing and violence. Walter went the furthest against his own flesh by committing suicide and continuing to exist only as thought within his own subconscious hellscape. In his private mental domain, Walter mourns for his own innocent younger self, agonizing about who he once was. Walter holds the bizarre belief that his mother is an apartment building, rather than a callous woman who abandoned him immediately after giving birth. The cult sacraments, he believes, will free his mother from the stains and corruptions of this world. Cultists can't seem to discern much difference between the hellscape of Samael and the real world and behave comfortably around monsters, as if they already see that day to day when they look at people.
Demons to some, angels to others.
A cultist likely sees the world in a similar manner. Maybe they started out that way because of alienation, depression, or abuse, or maybe the cult trained them to think of the outer world as bad and sinful. Part of all cults is to tear people away from family, friends, loved ones, and to create a siege mentality where the outside world is evil while the cult is good. Of course, it's just the opposite of that. The cult is an aberrant, cruel force, while the rest of the world is comparatively good. But to the minority of people who have been brutalized in some way in the regular world, they can't tell the difference between a good world and bad. Their self-hatred is a death shroud of fog that prevents them from knowing themselves or others or even distinguishing good and evil. Alessa sees the other children in her own classroom as monstrous because of their bullying. Claudia Wolf sometimes has clarity that the demons and creatures around her are awful and that harming others is sinful. But she sees the regular world as an extension of her own feelings of uncleanliness and ugliness. If we don't make sure to help and include the alienated and outcast in our society, we will always have to deal with the effects of alienation. Claudia and Walter turn to fantasy and imagination to erase the horrors of the real world, only to craft an even more wicked place in their heads. Multiple Silent Hill characters have a victim complex that makes them feel just and lashing out at others. What if we could externalize the pain and anguish of emotional torment? Well, that would really be violence and acting out that people actually do in the real world. They try to externalize the pain in their heads. It's just done more metaphorically in Silent Hill. Although we mustn't forget that the only way they can show others this dark, hellish place in their heads is through the cult. For them, the dark rituals and beliefs of evil are a roundabout manner of explanation to a world they think hates and curses them. Claudia and Walter were both raised by bizarre religious beliefs. They both refused to acknowledge that the cult was the true source of their pain and suffering. Instead, they plunged further into the world of violence and cruelty that spawned their pain in the first place. The only thing they ever knew in childhood was instilled by religious fanatics, and they never broke out of it, remaining metaphorically in a hazy realm always terrified by monsters. But they were the ones that really created those monsters themselves. The cult of Silent Hill brainwashed dozens of children, drugged its followers to make them easier to control, and set about rituals of destruction to turn the planet into a living nightmare. Getting them while they're young is a fundamental part of all cults, from Hitler Youth's indoctrination programs to David Koresh. In Silent Hill, orphan children were imprisoned in a building deep in the Silent Hill woods. There they were told the outside world was hostile and dangerous. Of course the opposite was true, but to a child how could they tell the difference? If that is all they knew and the outer world shunned them for being cultists or weird in some way, they must have assumed the hostility of others to be true, and then were hostile to them in return, repaying them in kind. And there they stayed, much like Leland Palmer from Twin Peaks, trapped in a cycle of abuse and victimization.
Appetite. golden circle.
But what if I told you this cult existed in the real world? A cult that wanted to bring about the apocalypse, worshiped the god of destruction, drugged thousands of people, experimented in chemical warfare, brainwashed hundreds of children and toddlers with electrode brain helmets, and tried to commit mass murder. And they did all this in Japan just a few years before the first Silent Hill game was released.
At 5 locations on 3 different subway lines, deadly nerve gas is released. Passengers begin staggering from subway exits around the city, nauseous, vomiting, convulsing and collapsing, the sarin gas crippling their nervous systems. More than 5,000 people are hurt, some with horrific injuries. One woman's contact lenses fuse to her eyes. Both eyes have to be surgically removed.
The apocalyptic death cult Aum Shinrikyo, or Aum Supreme Truth, was a mishmash of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity that convinced tens of thousands of people in Japan and Russia that the end of the world was imminent and they should prepare for Armageddon. Led by a bizarre and violent, half-blind con man named Shoko Asahara, he was able to convince his followers that Japan was teetering on the edge of annihilation. Eventually, Asahara told his devotees that the world was impure and needed to be cleansed with the holy fire of nuclear war. After that, he would die and be resurrected as a living god. Asahara, as a new god, would then rule over the apocalyptic wasteland of the earth with his demented flock. Walter Sullivan and Claudia Wolf both do everything in their respective games, as the Descent of the Holy Mother states, to cleanse the world with my rage, and once the Holy Mother is reborn, the nation of sin shall be redeemed. Their main power base was in the quiet rural town of Kamakuashiki. Similar to Silent Hill, Kamakuashiki was a small town off the beaten track, and far from the prying eyes of law enforcement. The perfect Stephen King small town with bucolic charm concealing something wicked lying underneath. The cult built an elaborate series of huge, ugly warehouses and prefab buildings. Within the compound were bizarre shrines to twisted visions of God, drugged cultists and torture chambers surrounded by an intestinal mess of wires, cables, generators, and machines. There the cultists ran their criminal network to rob or defraud millions of dollars from cult members and their families. The center of the cult eventually included training rooms, tiny prison cells to lock up recalcitrant cultists, metal drums to store corpses, weapons manufacturing, and most ominously, chemical laboratories. Both the Silent Hill cult and Aum Shinrikyo used powerful hallucinogenic drugs to keep people under control. Native Americans in ancient Silent Hill used a local plant, White Claudia, to commune with the spirits of the town. The cult in Silent Hill 1 took this plant and used it to manufacture PTV, a powerful drug with psychedelic properties. LSD was also a feature in Aum's death cult, where chemical labs produced huge quantities of psychedelics. They sold some to bring in revenue, and the rest was given in megadoses to cult members, to help them commune with the gods, or climb the ladder of transcendence, as they put it. The chemical labs were also used for hideous experiments in making nerve gas and eventually biological warfare agents like anthrax. Aum and the Silent Hill cult both became convinced that the end of the world was coming. Shiva the Destroyer, a massively distorted vision of a Hindu deity, and Samael to the cult were both believed to be predestined to purge creation of life. So the cultists felt they must help the gods to fulfill this plan. Afterwards, a golden age of peace and happiness would descend on the planet. Well, at least for the cultists it would. The cycle of birth and death and creation-destruction is present in quite a few religions, including Ragnarok and its aftermath in Norse mythology, the Christian apocalypse, and most importantly Shiva, who is the force of positive destruction, that is, destruction like a forest fire that wipes out an old, dying forest filled with rot so it can grow again as something beautiful. All of the other worlds of Silent Hill games feature rust, corrosion, and decay, a reflection of the cult's view that the world is swamped in dirt and sin. To accept the death of so many average people, occultists must be drowned in a sense of alienation. Everything in the outer world to abuse and neglect victims Claudia Wolfe and Walter Sullivan looks in their inner minds like monsters. People are either abusers, fellow victims, or everyday people reduced to non-entities because they couldn't heal or prevent their pain. Cults use deprivation, threats, trickery, and the most manipulable emotion of all, love, to switch the world around them. Black is white, up is down, dark is light, murderers are saviors. It's easy to want to create hell out of a place you hate and think hates you back. The terror of hell and demons will wipe out the people that ignored you, hated you, hurt you, stopped you from reaching your goals. Aum was certain that the world would be cleansed with nuclear fire and only the holders of the supreme truth would survive. Both Aum and Silent Hill's cult had large criminal enterprises designed to rip off as many people as possible, especially their followers. Top cultists who are primarily responsible for financial matters are present in both cults. Some of the men who rise to power in cults are venal and treacherous. They love the wealth and power, but they don't want to risk their position to further the cult's evil desires. Perhaps the most frightening cult members are not the gullible or ignorant, but intelligent, bright young people who sell their lives for power. Aum Shinrikyo's command structure was filled with smart people with degrees in math or science from top universities. Yet they too felt cut off from the rest of the world and in need of belonging to a group. They surrendered prosperous lives to become criminals and mass murderers. Those types of men became two powerful but deceitful and cruel members of the Silent Hill cult. Vincent is a wealthy young man who used his money to rebuild the cult. He is a believer, but a pragmatic one that wants to use the cult as a vessel for power and money, not to destroy the world. More ominous and more vicious is Dr. Michael Kaufman, a medical doctor at Alchemilla Hospital. Kaufman belongs to the respected class of educated men with good degrees and careers. Yet he willingly signs up with the dark ramblings of the local religions, along the way torturing young Alessa, drugging the townsfolk, and becoming increasingly nervous about summoning a demon from hell. Kaufman deliberately caused pain and suffering to continue, the polar opposite of what a doctor is bound to do. Notably, a major figure in Aum Shinrikyo was a doctor, Ikuyo Hayashi. Hayashi held senior posts at excellent hospitals in Tokyo, eventually disregarding all of that to become servant to a madman. He was also responsible for running Aum's notorious death clinics. They would find vulnerable elderly people, preferably without family, and begin a series of quack treatments designed to spiritually heal them. After severely painful treatments, like submerging into a bath of scalding hot water and the huge amounts of unnecessary drugs they were given, the patients signed over their life savings to the cult. In these horror houses, some of which were in Tokyo itself, Aum doctors and nurses, supervised by Hayashi, would essentially torture their patients until they died. Dr. Kaufman became worried enough about the cult's beliefs to take precautions in case things got out of hand. And when they did, he was a key component of stopping the cult at the end of the game. Kaufman, just like Dr. Hayashi, helped to supervise making illegal drugs, and held people against their will in his dark hospitals. Kaufman and Vincent, despite their crimes, were essentially venal characters who were always seeking profit and looking after their own interests. The real-world cultist Dr. Hayashi went beyond his fictional counterparts. To the shock of Japan and the world, Dr. Hayashi violated everything a doctor is supposed to stand for and attempted mass murder by spreading nerve gas onto a subway train. Hayashi later renounced the cult, denounced its leaders, and apologized for his actions. Medical themes like hospitals, nurses, patients, and doctors run throughout the Silent Hill games. Spooky hospitals are a staple of horror fiction and have long since become cliché. It's a testament to the brilliance of Silent Hill's creators that they were able to breathe fresh life into the hospital setting and make them truly nightmarish. Hospitals make us feel helpless whether we are a patient or watching a loved one suffering with impotent powerlessness. Underpinning the horror of the hospitals are real-world fears of the houses of healing. Without grounding the fears of the hospital in reality, we wouldn't find them as frightening. Actual medical suffering of a burn victim in Silent Hill 1, a terminal disease in Silent Hill 2, an unwanted pregnancy in Silent Hill 3, and Walter's disturbing surgical practices in Silent Hill 4 all evoke real-life pain without reaching for the supernatural. The games use that medical sense as a foothold in reality to spin off a fantastic nightmare. Some of the beliefs of Aum are quite similar to the cult in Silent Hill 1, namely their belief in the nastiness of the real world. Some forms of Buddhism or Christianity have, like many religions, taught that the physical world is evil and only an inner mental realm, whatever that means, is pure or true. They can't overcome dualism, the notion that the mind and the body are two separate things rather than the reality that the body and mind are one entity, not separate opposing forces. An old Buddhist ritual involved a monk purging himself of sexual desire by going to a cemetery. There he would slowly watch the body of a woman decompose. view the flesh falling off, maggots writhing around, smell the horrid stench of the grave. He transformed in his mind the image of a beautiful woman he desired into a stinking corpse to forbid carnal thoughts. The madmen of Aum believed that weird psychic energy from the brain can create miracles, and punishing their bodies with harsh asceticism will unlock that power. Some believed that they could levitate, cure illness, or communicate with their guru through telepathy. Underlying all of this is turning the everyday natural functions of the body into a vessel for horror. They're transfixed by the ugliness and disease inherent in possessing a corporeal form. The hideous sacks of meat and flesh are all around in every Silent Hill game, reminding us always of sex and death, our powerful need to reproduce ourselves before our life functions cease. Religion is supposed to reinforce the specialness and goodness of human life by emphasizing how actions beyond the physical world in our minds or souls are better than any suffering we may endure. To the death cult, though, religion becomes a locus for hatred and despair at the suffering of life that can only be eradicated or purged by magic or powers from beyond. To some religions, life itself is nothing but a sexually transmitted disease, and the body must be hated as a vessel only capable of sin. Cultists, perhaps because of their own negative experiences with others, are drawn from people who hate the everyday world. They are the disconnected and disenchanted parts of our society that we would prefer to ignore. The Aum members in the documentary A are often shy, quiet, and pulled into their own heads. They would rather spend their evening meditating, doing yoga, and reading obscurantist works of religious lore. They discard their families, sexual partners, and careers in favor of worship, such as the profundity of their void-like emptiness. The cultists are shown eating horrible, tasteless food or fasting, and deliberately causing themselves pain by twisting into painful ascetic contortions. Driving most of them seems to be a desire to harm themselves. Many cult members are extraordinarily depressed or find life unenjoyable for some reason. The strange creation myth of the cult tells of man and woman aching and suffering, knowing only despair.
In the beginning, people had nothing. Their bodies ached, and their hearts held nothing but hatred. They fought endlessly, but death never came. They despaired, stuck in the eternal quagmire. A man offered a serpent to the sun and prayed for salvation. A woman offered a reed to the sun and asked for joy. Feeling pity for the sadness that had overrun the earth, God was born from those two people.
To a sad little girl like Claudia, that probably seemed utterly and totally true. Without the guidance of the cult, the characters of Silent Hill 2 act out of their own despair, alone, and schizophrenically drift between destructive and self-destructive behavior. The misery and self-hatred that Angela, James, or Eddie feel could easily be co-opted and used by dark people to do evil. That's not to say that all of them are evil or capable of violence. In fact, 2 of the 4 heroes of the original Silent Hill games, James Sunderland and Henry Townsend, are both described as withdrawn, socially awkward, and emotionally cold. They're out of touch with everyone, probably can't make friends easily. James, at least, is described as ornery and bad-tempered at times, and Henry displays very little outward response to horrific displays around him. James Sunderland can fall quite easily into being manipulated by the dark forces of the town. He can take his own life if his self-hatred overwhelms him. He can learn to love one of the monsters of the town in the guise of his wife. He can even resurrect his dead wife into some kind of ghoul. But he can also embrace the future, consign his pain to the past, and move on into a new life. Claudia and Walter were enraptured by the cult, tormented by their pain and despair on through adulthood, and showed no signs of moving on. The cult had sunk its ideology of tortured despair and expiation through violence too deep. Even decades later, they were still stunted psychologically, childlike beings begging for affirmation and approbation from an authority figure. They'd sunk so far away from happiness, the only way they imagined to feel whole again is to do something they considered magnificent and heroic. It's a childish thought. Change takes time and energy and pain. A grand gesture of greatness won't fix your issues.
I saw the way he hit you, kicked you, and made you cry. The memory of his cruelty is forever burned into my mind.
Yes, yes, and that's why we need God.
What you call faith is nothing more than a child crying out for love. That's why you're all alone.
understand. None of you do.
And the entirety of the Silent Hill series is based upon the original acts of Alessa, a young girl who was born into the cult but rejected its brutal teachings and repeatedly thwarted her mother, learning to endure suffering to truly help others rather than sinking into despair and lashing out. In one powerful way, the conclusion of Silent Hill 3 is the ultimate battle between two figures, Claudia and Alessa, reincarnated as Heather. The ending is the ultimate triumph of a woman, Alessa, who rejected the cult's violence from the beginning and worked at great personal cost to embrace the future and happiness. By defeating Claudia, a similarly abused woman who embraced her abusers and spread the stain of anger and despair to a wider world instead of rejecting it and moving on as an adult without the cult that hurt her. Claudia wants to bring about paradise, a place without war, greed, or suffering. She was brutally abused as a child and totally broken emotionally. She despised the world, but most certainly hated herself. She was contemptuous of her body because of the vile things done to her year after year by her awful father, in an almost exact parallel of what happened to Angela Orozco, who also despised her body and perhaps suffered from some sort of body dysmorphic disorder. Claudia was the victim of a crime, yet like many victims she feels her body is unclean or impure and that she is one who is sinful or ugly, not the perpetrator. So to erase the impurity of her body and soul, she thinks she needs a god to purge the earth of the wicked and create paradise. Her body and soul, already tainted by cruelty and hate visited upon her, can be used as an instrument of evil to bring about the apocalypse. Claudia is torn by self-hatred and even cries miserably about what she's done. Her self-hatred runs so deep she's even willing to curse her own soul to hell, a very real, literal hell she can witness next door in order to save mankind. What will happen to her is not important because she despises herself, and she's willing to use her own body as a sacrifice, her own body and soul as a sacrifice. The desire to end their self-doubt and become a hero may motivate cult members. The yearning to save others is mocked relentlessly by Angela Orozco. It's implied that James is trying to help her, perhaps to distract himself from the same dire circumstances he finds himself in. The cultists of Aum Shinrikyo were given something that all the money, family, love, sex, careers, and respect couldn't provide: meaning. A sense of purpose that they were changing the world was so deep, Aum members abandoned reason to worship a psychotic, murderous tyrant. They turned everything upside down to fill the darkness in their hearts, but pointlessly expanded the web of nihilism and cruelty around them. They just projected the self-loathing it took to need a cult like Aum onto the world around them, like painting the other world over Silent Hill. Now, I don't have any proof whatsoever that Aum really influenced the makers of Silent Hill. I haven't found anything that says they saw it as something to draw from in their writing or design, but it seems almost impossible that it wasn't. That would be like saying someone wrote a show about terrorism a few years after September 2001 and wasn't influenced by 9/11 at all. It was a titanic world event in 1995, and the entire country was focused with a laser light on it for over a year. In the vague, woolly realm of feeling and emotion, the characters of the Silent Hill games seem to be very much related to the dark millenarian cult of death known as the Supreme Truth. The bleakness and despair of so many Silent Hill characters, coupled with their exploitation by ruthless egomaniacs, perfectly mirrors how a cult can be born. Much of the destruction, torment, and death in Silent Hill can indeed have happened in the real world without needing any demons or monsters at all. Aum tried to purchase nuclear weapons in the former USSR with the intent of destroying Tokyo or starting a nuclear war. A bizarre part of the 21 Sacraments liturgy is that the nations of sin shall be redeemed. Both Silent Hill and Aum wanted to bring terrible wrath down on the heads of mankind because of the spiritual pollution of the material world. A theme of child abuse runs through much of the Silent Hill games. In fact, all 4 of the original games, along with Origins and Homecoming, feature characters that were either sexually or physically abused. And the water prison in Silent Hill 4 shows the cult brutalized children on a mass scale for years or perhaps decades. Maybe that was where they drew much of their cult members from. Abuse of the young was a major feature of horror in the Aum capital deep in the woods around Mount Fuji. Hundreds of kids were discovered by the police after they raided the Aum compound in 1995. They were found separated from their parents in near darkness, watching cult-produced cartoons, regurgitating bizarre Aum liturgies, and eating grim, tasteless, dirty food. Perhaps most shocking was that all of them, including infants of 2 years old, were wearing Aum electrode caps. A strange electric device worn like a helmet that administered a powerful electric jolt a few times a minute. When taken into care, the children often did not know who their parents were and thought Shoko Asahara was a god incarnate. The creepy medical nature of Aum Shinrikyo is their most terrifying feature. The deranged Buddhists managed to convince dozens of trained technicians and scientists in advanced fields of study to join their organization. They were a high-tech cult that was able to use their training to attempt to engulf a city in clouds of poison gas, thus exterminating the remaining population of Japan. All cultists would assume their place as the leaders of the New World. Eerily similar to things that occur in Silent Hill, medical men are trained to understand how to manipulate the flesh of the body. And one of the most famous cultists, the man who misused his knowledge to hurt others, was a medical professional. Perhaps the prominence of medicine in Aum left an enduring mark on the people who wrote Silent Hill. Cults in general seem like a fascination for the man who started everything, Keiichiro Toyama. Toyama went on to make Siren, another survival horror game series about cults operating in small towns. It seems unlikely that a man so interested in cults would not incorporate the most famous cult in Japanese history into his games. But even if the Japanese terror cult did not directly influence the game, Aum became a powerful symbol of fear to every Japanese living at that time. And much of the Silent Hill series perfectly captures the horror of cult beliefs and the emotional underpinning of a cultist's psyche. Despair, alienation from others, projection of your own disgust of the body onto spiritual impurity of the world, and mad beliefs about mass murder to save the soul of the planet and attain mighty powers for yourself. These emotions played heavily on Silent Hill characters in the first 4 games. We've got a window into a very dark world that unfortunately exists in our own reality, not just in a video game. There's also an interesting parallel with the possible murders the cult commits of people investigating the cult. They only bring this up as an aside in Silent Hill 1, but a number of people in town died of mysterious heart attacks. It's later revealed that they were given drugs, possibly with the help of Dr. Michael Kaufman. Exactly what Aum Shinrikyo did when they brutally injected an anti-Aum lawyer and his wife and their infant child with fatal overdoses. Lurking around both the cult and Aum is medical perversion mixed with drugs and murder. And finally, there's another point I want to bring up. To close this, let's talk about Harry Mason, the main character in the first game. Harry is an everyday Joe that stumbles upon the nightmare breaking loose in Silent Hill. He proves effective at defeating the devilish beasts unleashed on the town and tracks the cult's activities across Silent Hill. Harry, and thus the player, is on a journey of discovery to learn and understand the cult, the town, and the world. The game shows, not tells, as a good game should, and you're free to use your own reason to unpack the story. Harry's name is elaborated upon in the developer interviews in the Book of Lost Memories, a kind of Bible for Silent Hill fans, sometimes to their detriment. In that book, in an oft-repeated story, we learn that creepily Harry Mason's name was originally to be Humbert Mason. It's a rather sick joke in reference to Lolita. Harry is jokingly hinted at being a pervert who is obsessed with his adoptive daughter for other reasons that we get in the game. But then there's this.
In 1993, the calm of the Australian outback was shattered by an explosion, which registered 3.7 on the Richter scale. Geologist Harry Mason had been working in the region for nearly 30 years. He decided to investigate.
I began to research this, but I had no idea where this was going to go. I mean, I was researching a fireball, an explosion, an earthquake, which we thought was a meteorite impact. This has taken me right around the world. It's gone into a whole new universe of weapon systems and skullduggery and espionage, and I'm afraid the data is tending more and more towards these horrific new weapons of war.
The area Harry was looking into was Banjuan Station. This remote sheep station had belonged to the Aum Shinrikyo, a Japanese religious cult held responsible for the terrorist nerve gas attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995, which killed 12 people and injured thousands.
Banjuan Station had been purchased by the Japanese Aum cult. Then I heard how the Aum had attempted to purchase nuclear weapons from the Russians and were thought to have attempted to make their own. Well, we started to put all this together and we didn't like what we were seeing. In fact, we seriously began to wonder if they hadn't detonated a small nuclear device somewhere on Banjuan Station.
Hold on just a minute. Are you telling me that a man named Harry Mason hunted down proof of the cult's plans for mass murder and gathered evidence that they were using this poison, and showed people how the cult practiced using poison gas to kill people? And his name was Harry frickin' Mason, the name of the protagonist of the first game about a guy who stumbled across an evil cult and investigates them? Seriously? There's no chance whatsoever that the developers are just fucking with us when they give us the origin of Harry's name as Humbert? That it's a joke on us? Really? It's just an accident that the names are the same. Out of all the thousands of Western first and last names, they happen to pick those two that had something to do with an evil cult. Really? I guess. Well, from everything I've seen, it probably is. But damn, that's one hell of a coincidence.